you coming here today to really celebrate Filipino-American history, heritage, culture, and all the things that come with it. I saw a grill outside, so I'm hoping there's some barbecue after this. I'll just use this guy. Okay. All right. Okay, so the ancestors were like, stop talking about food, I need to mess with your life. It's so good to be here. This is my first time traveling in a while, which is also really odd because we're still in this pandemic, and so it's really nice just to be able to be physically in community with you all, and especially for this to be a FANHS event. So FANHS is Filipino American National Historical Society. We're the oldest national organization here that still exists here in the United States, and honored to have Georgia be one of our newest chapters. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about Filipino American history. The title of my presentation is no longer The Forgotten Asian Americans, documenting Filipino American history and imagining Filipino American futures. When I first was thinking about what we should call this presentation, I've been thinking a lot about some of the earlier works of people who first started advocating for Filipino American studies. And one of them, who I'll talk about a little bit more in detail later, is the late Fred Cordova. Many of us know him as Uncle Fred. And he first wrote this book called Filipinos Forgotten Asians. And that book came out in the 1970s or 80s, and it really was one of the first publications that really captured Filipino American history in a cumulative, comprehensive way. And the title of his book really referenced how Filipino Americans, although at the time they were one of the largest Asian American groups, they had already such a rich history in the United States, were tended to be forgotten. And even now, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, Filipino Americans, although still one of the largest Asian American groups, one of the largest immigrant groups, we still tend to be forgotten. And this is why it's so important for us to come together as a community, come together in solidarity with other communities, because we need people to know that we exist, we've been here, and we will continue to do all these wonderful things. And so I want to just first give another shout out to the organizers of this, because it's one reflection of the ways that Filipino Americans are saying that we're here and we are continuing to thrive. So give the organizers our big round of applause. So before I even start, I always like to acknowledge the ancestors. I like to acknowledge the people who really had to blaze trails in order for me to be where I am today. When I think about my ancestors, I think about Filipino American ancestors in general. For me, I think about the Manons. These are the earliest Filipino immigrants who came to this country, oftentimes under the most dire circumstances, and still managed to survive and even thrive. For some of them, they were able to advocate for our rights. In fact, civil rights leaders, labor rights leaders, Larry Indiong and Gilbert Cruz, they were the leaders of one of the most successful labor movements in American history, and that is the United Farm Workers Movement. But their stories are still not told. And so I acknowledge and I bring them into this room, and I'll share a little bit more about their stories in a bit, but I bring in Mama Larry and Mama Philip with me today. As a queer person of color, I also acknowledge all of the trailblazers who had the audacity to live their lives in order for future generations to be able to succeed, be seen, and even just exist. And so I thank people like Mother Marcia P. Johnson, Mother Sylvia Rivera, Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, and Wewa. I acknowledge that we are settlers here on colonized lands, and I thank the indigenous peoples whose land we're on today. I acknowledge that this country was built on genocide and slavery, and we bring in all of those folks who have been killed or hurt or violated oppressed, and recognizing all of those sacrifices for us to be here today. On a personal level, I say thank you to the trailblazers who had a direct impact on my life. When I think about the elders, Filipino-American community leaders, people like Fred Cordova and Dorothy Cordova, early psychologists like King Sarafika or Lenny Strobel, or people who really fought for ethnic studies and for Filipino-American studies as we know it today. I thank the Filipino-American National Historical Society, for they are why I'm here today, because they saw something in a young kid who first joined their organization at 19 years old, and 3 years later, no, just kidding, 20-something years later, yeah, I think that's right, here I am. I say salamat to my parents. My parents are from Aklan, Philippines, so we don't say salamat, we say salamat. As immigrants who came to this country, they really put everything on the line to provide more opportunities to their children that didn't exist yet. When I think about that ultimate sacrifice that immigrant parents made, especially back then, my parents first came, my mom first landed in the United States in the 1960s. She was a visiting nurse. She worked at Cook County Hospital in Chicago just a couple years before Filipino nurses were murdered outside of Cook County Hospital. My mom left her small province in Aklan because she wanted to live the American dream. And so she, in her 20s, saw an ad in the magazine to come to the United States to become a nurse. And so she did that. She came here to Chicago. She was in this program for a couple of years, and her visa expired. So she moved back to the Philippines with the intent of always coming back to the United States. And along the way, she met my father in Manila. He also was from Aklan, so that was their bond that they have. But on their very first date, she told him, "I'm moving back to America. If you want to date me, you have to marry me, but if not, bye." Yes, so she was the true fiance of the Philippines in the 60s. And so my father had no intention of moving to the United States, but he wanted to marry her. And so they got married in the Philippines. They were able to come back to the United States, and seamlessly due to the 1965 Immigration Naturalization Act, which put an end to racial quotas. And so when I think because they wanted to start a better life for themselves, but even more specifically for these children that weren't even born yet. They wanted us to have things that they didn't have. They didn't even know whether they would have children or what that would look like, but they still gave up everything. At a time when there was no social media, there was no cell phone service, you could only write letters to each other, at a time where travel was very limited, where you never knew if you were going to see your parents again, they took that sacrifice. And so thinking about my own life, like I don't know that I would leave and go to another country where I didn't know anybody, simply to give or to provide more opportunities for my family. And so I acknowledge my parents. My beginnings start with my parents, and then start with just my family in general. My parents are immigrants. I was born in the 1970s as the youngest of 3 children, and obviously the cutest. But when I think about our experience as Filipino Americans who grew up here in the United States, I think of one that maybe other people in the room are familiar with. We grew up as very Filipino and also very American. Psychology and sociology researchers would later identify this concept as being biculturalism, and that's the ability to be able to navigate 2 different worlds. For some folks, it's being Mexican and American. Other folks, it's being Nigerian and American, and in many ways, it's learning how to balance the two. So for me, it was knowing that at home we ate Filipino food. My parents spoke to us in Aklangon and English. My parents tried to instill a lot of Filipino values in us. We prayed the rosary every Friday. And then we would go to school, and at school we would speak only English with our peers. We would ask our parents to pack us with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We didn't really think much about being Filipino. As time progressed, there were opportunities for us to be able to integrate those things, where I could be Filipino at school, I could be American at home, and for many of us, we even engage in what we call code switching, which is that we learn how to navigate different spaces and how to even switch up the ways that we speak, the types of language that we use, even our mannerisms, and in a way that is almost automatic, that you just know to do it without even thinking twice about it. And that's what it means to be a child of immigrants for me. For being a child of immigrants, also one of the things that was really important or such a significant part of my life is learning how to be the first generation of American. Right? And so oftentimes my parents didn't know about a lot of the things that I was growing up with. My parents sometimes struggled with English, even though they learned English in school, they didn't know necessarily how to apply it here in the United States. Oftentimes we serve as translators between our parents and teachers, or our parents and even like store clerks. And so being here, as a child growing up in the United States, that added even more of a pressure that if you think about is something that maybe other kids don't necessarily think about, right? For me to have to think about consciously being responsible for communicating with other people because my parents might not necessarily have known how to do that. And so that's a part of my experience as well. I grew up brown. I grew up in California, and where I grew up, there were a lot of Filipino people. Growing up in California, where there are a lot of Asian American people, Filipinos were viewed as, and are viewed, as a very unique, distinct group. We had Filipino cliques that were very separate from other Asian American cliques. And part of that was because people stereotyped Filipinos differently, or they viewed us differently. And part of that might have been because of our skin color, right? So Filipinos tend to be darker in skin color than other groups. We also have a lot of unique cultural factors that might influence our identities and influence our abilities to relate to and get along with other groups. So for me, being Filipino meant that I actually had mostly Filipino friends, but my other friends were Black or Latino, and that was just a norm. I would later learn that this is something that would happen to people from all over the country, where Filipinos learn how to build friendships and coalitions with other people of color in ways that sometimes other Asian Americans, especially East Asian Americans, had difficulty with. And part of that could be that we have a lot of shared experiences and histories. So in the same ways that Filipinos were colonized by the Spanish, Latinos were colonized by the Spanish too. In similar ways that Filipinos learned about racism and oppression and were taught to be ashamed of their cultures, right? Especially when they were colonized by the United States. There's a similar experience to indigenous people or Black Americans. And so that was something that brought us together. And then as you look at history, you'll see that Filipinos and other communities of color have also formed bonds over lots of things, ranging from activism, fighting for ethnic studies, or advocating for housing equities among communities of color, to even shared interests. So in the earlier hip-hop movements, Filipino Americans were there because they were friends with Black American communities. And so that was something that I found to be, was part of my experience, but later through research I found was something that a lot of people experienced as well. I just want to briefly mention my intersectional identity. So I talked about this before, Alex mentioned. So I'm queer, I'm Filipino, I'm a brown Asian American. I grew up in California, I've been living in New York for 20 years. I'm a father, I'm a husband, and a professor. And so I bring that up because I think it's so important for us to acknowledge all of the different identities that we each individually have. And how that might affect our lived experiences. Filipino Americans are so diverse. We have men, women, non-binary people, trans people. We have people from the Visayas, from Luzon, from Mindanao, from Pangasinan. We have people who speak Tagalog or Ilocano, people who don't speak any Filipino language. We have first generation, second generation, third and fourth generation. We have black Filipinos, we have white mixed race Filipinos. We're all Filipino. And we have to acknowledge that our community is so diverse and that we need to be inclusive, we need to celebrate that diversity, we need to make sure that everyone feels included, safe, and seen whenever they come to us, right? In FANHS, we have a metaphor that everyone is welcome to the table. And Uncle Fred Cordova would say that if you have one drop of Filipino in you, meaning that you have a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent who is Filipino, then you're one of us. And others would add, and if you are Filipino at heart, meaning that you are maybe not Filipino genetically, but you know how to chill with us, and that you can eat balut, then you're one of us too, right? So, welcome to our table. Let's continue to build our tables, and let's continue to be aware of intersectional identities. Queer people shouldn't feel afraid or unable to be themselves within our community in the same way that people of color shouldn't feel ashamed or excluded when in mainstream LGBTQ communities. And so this is something that I hope we all remember. Alex mentioned I was the first Filipino American distinguished professor at CUNY, which is the City University of New York, which is the largest public university school system here on the East Coast. And I've been the first in a lot of ways. I'm the first person in my family to get a PhD, first person in my family to become an author, lots of firsts in my life. And it's always an honor to hold those titles, and it's always nice when people recognize those things or remember those things. And it's also important for me to acknowledge that while we should celebrate first, to understand that there are still very few firsts in our communities. We have very few Filipino Americans who are in public office. We have very few Filipino Americans who are CEOs of major companies. We have very few Filipino Americans who are in different fields and different sectors. And we need to understand that while we can celebrate first, we have to make sure that there are seconds and thirds and fourths who come behind us. And so I know there are a lot of students here. I think about you and your trajectories, and for you to think about what can I be the first at? Whether it's I can be the first in my family to graduate with a STEM degree, I can be the first in my family to become a politician. I can be the first in my family to go viral on tickling on the internet. Oh wait, you already did that. So whatever it is, and then to think about what can I do to ensure that there are others that come behind me. All right. I see you. I saw that tickling. That was pretty good. Who was in that video? Anyone here? They're practicing tickling somewhere. They're outside practicing. Okay, perfect. So I can't wait to see that. I'm going to talk about Filipino American history, and I think it's important for me to just start off with FANHS. I mentioned FANHS before. FANHS is Filipino American National Historical Society. Our mission is to preserve, document, and present Filipino American history, and to support scholarly research and artistic works which reflect that past. As I mentioned before, Filipino Americans have oftentimes been erased in general American history, as well as even in Asian American studies. And so FANHS was created as a way for us to document our history, to preserve our history. If they're not going to include us in their history books, then we have to write our own histories. FANHS currently includes 40 chapters across the United States, including Georgia. If you're interested in joining the FANHS Georgia chapter, please see Alex or Annalisa or any of the other officers. We are involved in public programming, photo exhibits, oral history lectures, and so forth. We have a National Keynote Archives in Seattle, which essentially is a place where we have photos, files, birth certificates, death certificates of Filipinos throughout history. So you go there, you might be able to find something from one of your family members. We've been advocates for historical site designations, including San Malo in Louisiana, Morro Bay in California, and we engage in a lot of public service. I mentioned them before, at least one of them before, Fred and Dorothy Cordova. They are the founders of FANHS. Auntie Dorothy is 90 years old, and she's the founder and executive director of FANHS. Her husband, Fred Cordova, is the founding president of FANHS. They're activists in Seattle since the 1950s. They founded Filipino American Youth Activities, which is cited as the first Filipino American youth organization in the United States. And they're historians, writers, and activists, and as I mentioned, Uncle Fred wrote Filipinos Forgotten Asian Americans. I just want to give you a sense of who they are, so I have some quotes. Auntie Dorothy Cordova once said, "It is important for us to let people know that we are here, that we've done something in this country to help build this country." Uncle Fred once said, "Everybody doesn't have to be a hero. Everybody doesn't have to be famous. Each person who's Filipino American to me is very, very important as a story. Our stories are really in our people. It's not so much in what the achievements are as much as what is the story itself." When Uncle Fred said things like this, he passed away in 2013, what it really meant was that we have to really understand that all of our stories are important and that all of our stories will eventually become history. This is why it's so vital for all of us to document those histories. Talk to your parents, talk to your elders. What might have been just everyday life for them actually is an important documentation of what Filipino American history was. One of the reasons why I'm so excited to know that FANHS Georgia started a chapter was because there still is so little that is written or documented about the experiences of Filipino Americans in Georgia. When we know that there have been Filipino Americans here in Georgia for at least 50 years, probably more, but where are their stories? Where are those narratives, and how can we tell those more? So it starts with all of us individually. The other person I want to specifically bring into this room is my dear friend, our dear friend, Dr. Don Mabalo, who passed away in 2018. She was the FANHS National Scholar. She was a historian, a historic preservationist. She was also a professor at San Francisco State University before she passed unexpectedly. But she really exemplified the spirit of FANHS as well as the spirit of Filipino American history and preservation. She had said a lot of different things when she helped to fight for the preservation of Little Manila in Stockton. She said, "We reclaim the sacred space for our children and for our grandchildren and all those who will come after us. We will not let our history get bulldozed again, figuratively or literally." And so, again, realizing that there are certain parts of our history that are either erased passively or actively. And sometimes that even involves buildings and structures and actual places that are so important for us to understand our history. And so we have to fight to preserve that. So what I want to do is first talk about Filipino American history. So this presentation is about history and then looking into our futures. I don't know if you all have Filipino American studies here, and so maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you don't, hopefully this presentation will help you to advocate for Filipino-American history. We need to learn Filipino-American history, Filipino-American studies in our classroom settings. We don't only need to learn about the experiences of white people and Europe and colonizers and through the colonizers' perspectives. We have to learn about our narratives from our own perspectives. And so we're going to do a little bit of Filipino-American history today. I'm a professor, I like audience participation, classroom participation. Who can tell me when the first Filipinos landed in the United States? I see some hands, we'll go here first.
Wasn't the 1500s in Louisiana?
Yes! So, well, part of it is absolutely correct. 1500s for sure. So in 1587, Filipinos first landed in California, in Morro Bay, California. And they arrived as a result of the Manila Spanish galleon trades, in which there was trade between Spain, Mexico, and Manila in the Philippines. When they landed, they were met by the indigenous people who didn't want them there, rightfully so. And so there was an altercation. Filipinos picked up, they left, they went with the Spanish onto Mexico. The Filipinos were essentially indentured servants. They got paid very little. They were indigenous. They were used for their navigation skills. And through this Acapulco Mexican Manila trade, many of them ended up in Louisiana. So the people in Louisiana actually didn't arrive or settle until the 1700s. And so they first landed in California in 1500s. They went and traded between Mexico and the Philippines for a couple hundred years, and then they ended up in Louisiana. So in Louisiana, we call them the Manila Men, or that's what they were called. There were men who formed settlements, and they jumped ship from these galleons in which they were treated like slaves, essentially. They didn't want to take it anymore, so they jumped ship and they ended up in the bayous of Louisiana. Once they were there, they found that they were most skilled at shrimp farming. And so they engaged in shrimp farming. That's how they made their crop, that's how they made their money. Many of these techniques they learned from fishing back in the Philippines. When they were there, they were mostly men. Women didn't travel on these ships for lots of reasons. So now we had a bunch of men who who wanted to meet other women or form families, but there were no other Filipino women. So a lot of these men met, married, had children with the Black Creole women that were there in the South, or with the indigenous women that were there in the South as well. And so if you look at, or if you go to Louisiana, you'll find that there are Filipinos who live there who identify as 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th generation Filipino, and that can trace their lineage to these Filipinos from the 1700s. They might not look what people traditionally think of as Filipinos because they're mixed with lots of different racial ethnic backgrounds, but they are part of Philippine American history. So good job for knowing that. If I have like candy, I just got off Delta, I might have a cookie in my, that was not JetBlue, sorry. Delta is why I'm late, so we're gonna talk about that. All right, so when did other Filipinos come to the United States? So that was the first wave of Filipinos, was the Manila Men. People might not know this, but the Manila Men who were in the South actually fought in the Civil War. So there's documentation of Filipinos fighting in the Civil War, and they actually fought for the Union. So they were on the right. So they were fighting for freedom and justice alongside people of color and so forth. Anyway, that was one wave, right? Filipinos also came in the early 1900s. After the Philippine-American War, which is an actually huge part of American history that doesn't get talked about in history books. Raise your hand if you learned about the Philippine-American War in school. Okay, some did. All right, I didn't. So what's weird is that I went to a school, I said I grew up in a large Filipino community, I'm not kidding. My high school was 50% Filipino, so there was like 300 Filipinos in my graduating class. And we had one Filipino teacher, her name was Jocelyn, you saw her up, she's my Facebook friend. But our history classes didn't teach us anything. So can you imagine, half of your class is Filipino, a quarter of them are Mexican, and then the rest are Black and other Asian and sprinklings of white people, but they didn't think that it would be important to teach us about Philippine history or Philippine-American War. And so after the Philippine-American War in the early 1900s, or the end of it in the early 1900s, the United States colonized the Philippines. Philippines was freshly decolonized from Spain, but the United States colonized the Philippines, claimed it as a U.S. territory, and one of the things that they wanted to do was to civilize the Filipinos. And so they offer these opportunities for Filipinos to study at prestigious universities and colleges in the United States. So they call this the Pensionado Act of 1903. And pensionados are essentially students, sponsored students by the United States to study here in the US. And so at any given time, hundreds of Filipinos were migrating to start here at different universities. This is a photo, I think, from UC Berkeley in the early 1900s. But Filipinos were all over the place. In New York, they were in places like Columbia and NYU. Here's a photo of Pensionadas, the women that were here. This is Teachers College, where actually Alex and I received our doctorates. Alex, which one are you? I thought we always said, I'm one with the pearls. That's my close confidant. But there were Filipinos here. I know there are Filipinos who studied in Georgia. We have to uncover their stories. There was a thing called the Filipino Student Directory from that time, and essentially it was any Filipino who was part of this pensionado program, they would write to headquarters, which happened to be in New York, and say, hey, I'm studying at Georgia Tech, or I'm studying at Emory, and their names were all compiled in this directory. So some might say it was the original Facebook and Instagram. And they sent photos, and that's where we got a lot of these photos are from that newsletter. But this might be important to look up the history of Filipinos here in Georgia. Some Filipinos came through Ellis Island. What people might not know is that this is an important part of history. When they think about Filipino immigration, they think of maybe Filipinos migrating through the West Coast, Hawaii, California, but there were Filipinos that came to Ellis Island as early as the late 1800s. Many Filipinos were part of the U.S. Navy. They were recruited after the Philippine-American War to join the Navy as seamen. I always feel weird saying that, seafarers. And they were not officials in the Navy, but they were stewards and cooks and mess boys, which also sounds funny. But they came to the United States that way. So some of them formed settlements in various naval cities. So for example, the Brooklyn Navy Yards housed many Filipinos, thousands of Filipinos, and that became one settling point. Virginia Beach, anyone from Virginia Beach? So there was another settlement over there. And so this is another way that Filipinos came to the United States, was through the Navy. So when did other Filipinos come to the U.S.? Many people might be a little bit more aware of the farm workers who came to the United States in the early 1900s. So again, after the Philippine-American War, Filipinos are now part of the United States. The Philippines is a territory, so Filipinos could come freely between the Philippines and the United States. We also have to remember that there was this thing called the Asian Exclusion Act, or the Chinese Exclusion Act, which actually banned Asian people, and specifically Chinese people, from coming to this country. And so while Filipinos were legally able to come here, they often had to experience some of the backlash from that Asian Exclusion Act because people started to develop some of this anti-Asian bias that they learned from the government and from the media. But Filipinos came here as farm workers in California. They worked in the cabbage and lettuce fields, and eventually the grape fields. In Hawaii, they worked on the Hawaii sugarcane plantations. And in Alaska and in Seattle, they worked in the fish canneries. One of the things that I like when looking at these photos is how cleaned up they got at night. So look at the photos on the left. They worked on the fields for 12 hours a day for often as little as $1 a day. But at night, they would dress up, this is from the 1920s, and go to the dance halls and dance. Oftentimes, they would spend money dancing with with women who were there at these dance halls to make money to dance with these men. They would spend all their money because there were very few women that were around. There were also these anti-miscegenation laws, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that prevented them from marrying outside of their race. But there, at one point, were 100,000 Filipinos who had migrated to the United States during this time. There were very few Filipinas, however, there were some Filipinas that did migrate to the United States after World War II as war brides. So World War II, which took place mostly in the Philippines, at least the fighting that happened in Asia, that there were Filipino American soldiers as well as white American, black American soldiers who met women while they were serving in the Philippines. And so they met these Filipino women, and the War Brides Act of 1947 allowed these women to come into the United States. So this is the first time that there was a large amount of Filipino women who came to the United States. So we have the Manila men, the seafarers, and the farm workers who came, mostly men, but women started to come after World War II. One of the things that is for us to remember is that when it was mostly men, there were some women that came. Some of the women that came were wives or daughters of these Filipino men that came first. But there would be up to 30 men for every Filipino woman in a community. And that woman oftentimes was seen as the matriarch of the community. She cooked, she cleaned, she mothered these men, and as a result of that, these men might not have had other women, but they became family in this way. So what are some of the other struggles that Filipinos have faced in the United States? So this is a very known photo of, it says across positively no Filipinos allowed. This is from Stockton in the 1920s. Stockton, California is a town just east of San Francisco, north of the desert, and Stockton was once the place where hundreds of thousands of Filipino Americans migrated to live. And so, this is very reminiscent of some of the photos of segregation across the United States, where it would say for colored people only or whites only, but these were establishments where specifically Filipinos were targeted. Positively no Filipinos allowed in this establishment. So what are the different struggles? Well, one, there were these Igorot exhibits at the St. Louis Fair and the Coney Island and at other sorts of amusement parks in the early 1900s. So after this Filipino-American War, the United States wanted to show their citizens that it was good that we invaded the Philippines and that we colonized the Philippines because they were all savages and they needed to be educated or saved. In fact, there's a very famous poem by Rudyard Kipling called White Man's Burden, and it was about this need to save Filipinos who could not govern themselves. When we think about just this idea of how Filipinos were portrayed, is that they were portrayed as being uncivilized savages. So there was a campaign to bring Filipinos to the United States. And so they went to the indigenous tribes of the Philippines, mostly Igorots, but also other tribes as well. And they would have them live at these amusement parks. So the St. Louis Fair, this used to be a big thing, the expos, where they would show what are the newest things in technology and in culture and so forth. But in St. Louis in 1904, they brought thousands of Filipino people, indigenous people from the Philippines, and they had them live on these lands. While people were tourists or walking around, they got to see how Filipinos lived. And so it was very dehumanizing, very exoticizing. They got to take pictures with the Filipinos, and they made the Filipinos do things that maybe they didn't normally do. So for example, they did rituals every single day. They wore only their bahawks every single day, their loincloths, and they even tried to glorify things that didn't necessarily happen all the time, like eating dog or that sort of thing. And so this is one of the exhibits from the Coney Island Luna Park in the early 1900s, just in New York. But this sort of thing continued for about 10 years until the Philippine government signed or passed a law that said that they found these exhibits to be dehumanizing, and it was a clause that was under their anti-slavery clause, or their anti-slavery law. And so recognizing that these folks got paid very little, they were living in inhumane conditions, all for the benefit of white people getting to see that we were saving these Filipinos. Another major issue in Filipino American history was anti-miscegenation laws, and I mentioned this before, but anti-miscegenation laws were essentially these laws on local and state levels that prevented people of color from marrying white people. Many folks might be familiar with the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case, which put an end to the ban on interracial marriage. But this was something that affected Filipinos as well. So because there were so few Filipino women, there were these Filipino men who would meet women of other racial groups, especially white women, black women, Mexican women, indigenous women, and want to get married. If they wanted to marry a black woman or an indigenous woman, no one cared. They said, fine, do your thing. But if the Filipinos wanted to marry a white woman, they would be prohibited to do so. Some of the reasonings were, it's not natural. Another reason would be, well, what about the children? Another reason would be, it's against the Bible. Right? So these are similar types of arguments that we see for people wanting to prevent queer people, gay people from getting married. Same exact arguments, just 100 years prior to that. And so there were these laws that were enacted. Filipinos fought these laws, right? In 1930s, there was a famous Los Angeles court case called Roldan versus the County of Los Angeles. And essentially, the court case was that the Filipino was fighting. What was that? All right, just checking. All right, that wasn't anything about my Confederate statement, right? But the Roldan versus Los Angeles County case was because the law said in California that anyone of the Mongolian or Negro Mongolian or Negro race could not marry a Caucasian. So it was like the language of the interracial ban on marriage. But a Filipino stepped up and said, actually, Filipinos are not Mongolian, we are of the Malay race. And so they fought this in court. And so they cited literature that actually stated that in Asia there are Mongolian people, there are Malay people. These are now terms that we would say East Asian, Southeast Asian, etc. And so they fought that in court. And so for a brief moment of time, there was a judge that actually said, you're right, that Filipinos are not Mongolian. And so for a brief moment of time, Filipinos were able to marry whoever they wanted to in California. In fact, people traveled to California to get married because this law now said that they could get married. Until then, the California Attorney General said, no, we're going to change the language again. Now we're just saying that no one white can marry anyone non-white. So they changed it. But it kind of, again, is reminiscent of same-sex marriage and how people were preventing queer people from getting married, and so people travel across the lines to states where they could get married. And so this is why it's so important to know history, because history oftentimes repeats itself. I don't know what Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws were, but in places like New York, there were no anti-miscegenation laws. And so Filipinos were able to marry people of other racial groups, including our friend Dolores, whose parents, her father was Filipino, her mother was Canadian, and she was born in the 1950s because there were none of these miscegenation laws and her birth is today, so shout out to Dolores. Another thing for us to understand is that anti-Asian hate isn't new. Anti-Asian hate has been around for over 100 years, even more. For Filipinos specifically, there was the Watsonville riots of the 1930s. And this occurred because there was a growing amount of hatred towards Filipinos and other Asian people and other people of color who were presumed to be stealing their jobs and stealing their women. And so in especially California and in Washington, there were large amounts of Filipinos, there were very few Filipino women, and so these Filipino men, with their suits and their swagger, would start to court women of all these different racial groups. And as a result of that, white men got very mad, very upset. And so they started terrorizing Filipino people. This is alongside the general anti-Asian hate that happened along with Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Chinese massacre that happened in the late 1800s, but essentially it was where a bunch of white men decided they just wanted to kill all these Chinese people. One thing that was really fascinating when we were learning about the Chinese massacre was in killing, I think they killed like 18 people in one setting, which in today's standards would be considered a horrible thing that we would learn about forever and never stop talking about. Yet, how many people here have learned about the Chinese massacre? Hardly anyone, right? But in doing so, they essentially wiped off like 1/5 of the Chinese American population in Los Angeles, but yet something that we don't talk about. And so, specific to Filipinos, the Watsonville riots happened where white men terrorized these Filipino men, violently attacked them, hung them on trees, beat them to die. One person was documented as being killed, and his name was Fermin Tavera. And he was shot in a house where there were lots of Filipinos. He was in his 20s, early 20s, and he was 23 years old. And that's anti-Asian hate that had happened 100 years ago. I want to also mention the Delano grape strike. I mentioned Larry Leong and Bill Vera Cruz earlier, leading what would be later known as one of the most successful labor movements in United States history. But when people think about the United Farm Workers, they oftentimes think of Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez, was the leader that was most visible towards the end of the United Farm Workers. But he's the only one that gets recognized. People might not know this, but Filipinos actually started the grape strike. They were the first to strike. Cesar Chavez actually didn't want to strike. He said that they weren't ready, but the Filipinos said, no, we want to strike. So they struck first, Larry Leong as their leader. They invited Cesar Chavez to join. He agreed 10 days after the Filipinos had already been on strike. But they don't get credited for that. So while we see Cesar Chavez having movies and stamps and buildings named after him, there's very little spoken about Larry Leong and Bill Vera Cruz. And so this is why it's so important for us to share our history. Well, I'm going to go quickly now. The other thing I want to talk about is Filipino World War II veterans. We know that 260,000 Filipino Americans served in World War II. Some who were Filipino Americans that were already here in this country, others who were Filipinos in the country, who were then told that they can come to the United States if they served. They were also promised full military benefits if they served in that war, and the United States broke their promise. So these elderly seniors who had fought in the war never got those benefits that they deserved. Many of them died homeless. Many of them died in poverty because they weren't treated with the same, or didn't have the same type of financial compensation as they could have. And so, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the veterans, also acknowledging that they were fighting alongside the United States in war, and that war in general is problematic and at the same time, that the inequities that they experienced as soldiers is something that was part of our history. The last piece of history that I want to talk about is the fight for ethnic studies. So ethnic studies is something that we know today is the foundation of communities of color being able to tell our stories, our histories, through our own perspectives. If we think about your US history books, that if you were born and raised here in the United States, that we oftentimes learn about United States history from the perspective of the colonizer. We learned that the United States was founded in 1776. Maybe we'll learn that the people first came here in the 15 or 1600s, landed in places like Plymouth Rock or Provincetown. But we don't know is that the indigenous people had been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. We also don't recognize that, or we aren't taught to recognize issues related to genocide and slavery and systemic oppression. And so ethnic studies is an opportunity for us to share our history through our perspective, understanding that critical lens that we need in order to understand, learn about how our people, our community have been affected by everything happening in this country. So as I talk about these moments in history, I also think about the future. And as I think about the future, I think about the young children in our life who are Filipino American. And what can we do to advocate for them? And one of the things that's so important is to link history with the future. To understand that the types of lessons that we could have learned in history can be applied to our advocacy in the future. For us to remember that if we don't tell our own stories, that other people may either tell them incorrectly or not tell them at all. For us to recognize that if we don't document and preserve our own histories, that people aren't going to learn them or know them, or might even gaslight us into thinking that they don't exist. And so as I think about our futures, I think about our future generations, literally children who will then eventually become youth, but also futures as a community. Where is our community going to be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years? Are we going to continue to be a community in which people will no longer continue to not recognize who we are? Where people are going to continue to silence us, to view us as invisible? And so what can we do exactly? I think one thing that we can start off with is being more activists, or making ourselves more visible in activism and advocacy, fighting for justice in numerous ways. These past few years, we've seen people become more interested and invested in racial justice, in fighting for women's health rights, in understanding and fighting for LGBTQ rights, in understanding and fighting for the rights of people with disabilities or indigenous peoples and their lands. And that's something that Filipinos need to continue to do. We have such a history of oppression in which people of power and privilege have tried to hold us down. And while many of us might be successful in some ways, we have to remember that the types of stuff that people are still doing to other communities, they have done to our communities in the past. And this is why we have to advocate for it, because even if you're not personally affected by certain injustices, we recognize that any injustice is something that we need to fight against. The need for more Phil-Am research and scholarship, right? One of the reasons why I became a professor and why I started to write a lot of books, especially, is because I grew up never reading anything about being Filipino. I shared earlier that I went to a high school that was 50% Filipino, yet my teachers didn't teach us anything about being Filipino. We never read anything about being Filipino. It wasn't until I was even in college that I had ever even heard the term Filipino in a classroom, with the exception of like when it was Culture Day and you would bring lumpia, right? And then you'd say, right? That was the only time, but in a classroom setting, right? I had a sociology class where a professor mentioned the Filipinos and the Delano Ridge, right? And so thinking about that, like what impact does that have on young people to never hear about yourself or read about yourself in your schools or even within your own family, right? Where you're only watching others. While I think it's great that we now have a lot more diversity in our programming, in our school systems even, where we're learning about Black history and Latino history and Indigenous history, that sort of thing, and even other Asian American history. What happens when we don't learn specifically about Filipinos, right? And when it comes to the media, it's great that there are crazy rich Asians and there are never have I evers in the world and all things that we can relate to in some way. But if we're not having stories about ourselves, what impact does that have on us? And so this is why it's important for us to continue to not just be visible, but to really make it a point to ensure that we're represented well in every single field. And so for me, this is something that I was able to do in academia, but I hope that folks can think about what can you do in your specific field to advocate for more Filipinos. Just a couple of shout outs. So one is this is a book cover for Fred Cordova's book, Filipinos for Non-Asian Americans. And then these are two of my books. The middle one is Filipino American Psychology, the first book, comprehensive book on the psychology and mental health of Filipino Americans in the United States. It wasn't written, and so I felt I needed to write it. And upcoming is the Sage Encyclopedia of Filipina, Filipinas, Filipino American Studies. So the first comprehensive encyclopedia on Filipino American issues. It's coming out in October of 2022 this year, covering things from health to education to psychology to history to arts and humanities. And again, if no one else is writing it, we have to write it ourselves. So if something's missing, be the one to write it. The need for more Phil-Lab education. We need to advocate for our histories to be told in school systems and also within our families. So when it comes to histories being taught in school systems, we look at organizations like FANHS, which I've mentioned several times before, but I also want to shout out two other organizations, PEP and Keynote Teach. PEP is Pinay Pinoy Educational Partnership, so it's founded by Dr. Alison Santiago Cubales in San Francisco, and Pinoy Teach is a program that was founded by Patricia Halagao, who's now in Hawaii. These are programs that started off as after-school programs for Filipinos to learn about themselves in the classroom. And so they learned history, they learned arts, dance, crafts, all sorts of things for young people to start to embrace their culture. And so what are some of the things that you all can do to institutionalize the teaching of Filipino American history and culture? I also have two books here on the bottom. One is a historical children's book called Journey for Justice. So it's a children's book meant for children to learn about the United Farm Workers Movement through the perspectives of Larry Leong. I don't get any money for advertising this, but opportunity for young people to learn that we have a history, right? I don't know about you, but when I was young, I learned about white people like George Washington and Christopher Columbus, and then maybe I learned about Black people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but who else did I learn about? Right? And so maybe if we are able to celebrate some of our heroes like Larry Leong, Filipinos can find that sense of identity. This other book is Lolo and Me. It's a children's book representing a lot of children's books that are now being written about and sharing our perspectives. This book was actually written by my husband, so I do get a little bit of money from that. But buy it because it's great. And it tells our stories, have our children be able to see characters that look like them. I also just want to shout out the need for more Phil-Lab arts. I've already alluded to this before. We need to have more Filipino representation. Sometimes studios will deny you, Broadway will deny you from starting these projects or investing in these projects. But this is why we have to invest in these things ourselves. On the left is The Taboo, a film that came out in the early 2000s. Produced and directed by Filipino Americans, majority Filipino American cast. Upcoming in the summer, we have a film by Joe Coy, which is, again, produced by Filipino Americans, majority Filipino American cast. And I bring this into the room to acknowledge that Joe Coy is doing his part. He's bringing Filipino Americans into the mainstream, but to recognize that 20 years later, there's been nothing between these two films that have been produced by a major mainstream production company. And so we can celebrate the new things that are happening while also recognizing the invisibility that we continue to experience. The top is a new musical that's coming up called Larry, a new musical. It's the musical of Larry in Leon. It premiered its first set of songs at the Bravo Theater in San Francisco, but it's an amazing musical written by Gail Romasanta and Brian Molina about Larry in Leon's story. So if there are certain aspects of Filipino American history that you want to write about, write it. Don't wait for somebody to do that. Write those stories yourselves. And it might even be your own histories, writing about your own parents, grandparents, and their earlier struggles or experiences, or of these many parts of history that I shared earlier that still have never graced a mainstream stage. People still don't know about the farm workers. People still don't know about anti-miscegenation laws. They still don't know about the veterans. So how can we make those stories more known? And then on the bottom is, this is a short film that was produced by Marisa Arroy called Thank God in Filipino. And it's a very short film. It's like 5 minutes long. But it's about, it was created because New York Times did a similar type of documentary which they interviewed Asian Americans about what it meant to be Asian American, and they didn't include one Filipino. And even though we're one of the largest Asian American groups, the first Asian American group to have arrived in this country, settled in this country, erased from that narrative. And so Marisa Roy and others came together to create this film. And then the last thing I just want to reiterate, I've been alluding to this the whole time, but it's so important for us to build our own tables. For so long, we have been trying to make it in the mainstream, and I think we can continue to do that. But we also have to recognize that sometimes we just have to build our things on our own. We have to build our own organizations, we have to produce films and musicals on our own. We need to make sure that we have creative control over things, but it really takes us to support each other. This photo is from the Asian American Psychological Association Division on Filipino Americans, and it was founded by Dr. E.J. David and me and others who wanted to have a space for Filipino American psychologists to talk about Filipino American issues. We were and are members of the Asian American Psychological Association, but oftentimes our stories were either minimized or erased. And so we created this space. And it started out with just 7 of us, and now there are 300 members of this national organization. And so thinking about, for you all, what are some spaces that you can create? What are some tables that you can build and invite people to? If you look at the histories of your student organizations, for example, FSA, I imagine they started similarly with a few people who came together to celebrate Filipino American culture and history, and now you might have dozens of folks who are part of your organization, and now you going viral on the internet, right? So, what are some of the other spaces that you can continue to build? I don't have anything else particularly to say, but I do want to end by just inviting you all to think about what you all individually can do to advocate for Filipino American futures. What is something that you can start doing today? Whether it's talking to a parent, or a sibling, or a cousin about something you learned today throughout all the very many workshops. Whether it's talking to a principal or a teacher and asking them what they're doing to recognize Filipino American history, or if they're celebrating Filipino American History Month in October. Whether it's going to some of the officers of FANHS Georgia and asking them to join because you're really interested in preserving Filipino American history. But there's something that each of us can do every single day to advocate for our communities. There's also something that each of us can do every single day to advocate for justice. And that might be saying something if you experience a microaggression or you witness somebody doing something that's unjust. That might be sharing an opinion that might be unpopular, make people uncomfortable because you recognize that something had been done that was inappropriate or might have promoted social injustice. It also means standing in solidarity with all of our sibling communities of color who are undergoing many obstacles and racial traumas. But it really starts with you. And so I end by inviting you all to think about what is the one thing that you will do to make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadal. Okay, so it's time to eat, guys. And so please enjoy the food, the lunch boxes that were prepared by some local businesses. You get information. Please don't eat in the classrooms. Just keep everything clean. But yeah, thank you so much. And let me know